Well, joining me now is Mark Garnett, a senior lecturer in politics at Lancaster University. Thanks so much for speaking to us. We know
Hello.
Many of her own party members are very frustrated with her Brexit deal, but is this no confidence vote a bit short-sighted, given no one is eagerly waiting in the wings to take on this job at this time?
Yes, well, I think it's been known for a very long time that the required number of Conservative MPs were unhappy with Mrs May's leadership. So you could say that this is an event which was just waiting to happen. The fact it's happened now, I think, was triggered by the events of the last couple of days, when it seemed that Mrs May was just continuing to try to get a slightly improved agreement with the EU, and there's a sufficient number of Conservative MPs who just thought that that was in a way making Britain look a little bit silly, a little bit desperate, and that's one thing Conservative MPs particularly dislike. So I think that it's been waiting to happen for a long time, and it's just in the end that some people have lost patience, and I think they've begun to think, these particular people have begun to think, that Mrs May was hired by the party as leader because she was a safe option. Well, if a safe option looks like it's not actually going to produce a constructive result, then a risky option, which is the option before the party now, that seems to be less dangerous. So I think really it's a sign that the Conservative Parliamentary Party is now really kind of looking desperately for salvation, because it sees no good outcome under Mrs May's leadership.
So they're looking for the least bad at this point. But if she survives this no confidence vote, and it seems there's a good chance she actually will, could she and even her Brexit plan come out stronger, or is her deal too universally despised in Parliament?
Well, thinking through all the options today, if I was a Conservative MP with not very strong views, and there are some Conservative MPs who are fairly moderate on this issue, there would be temptation to rally behind Mrs May, because what you can then do is to say that we, the Conservative Party, are really focused on the national interest. Mrs May is the best person to lead Britain in this difficult time, and we've got to get behind her, and that might strengthen Mrs May and therefore strengthen the Conservative Party. So suddenly the person who looked very weak, her weakness suddenly becomes a great source of strength. But the trouble is, the parliamentary arithmetic is still terrible, and it's possible that more Conservatives would then rally behind Mrs May's compromise deal. The Labour Party might come under some pressure to get behind a compromise deal. But as Mrs May's problems getting concessions from the EU become more clear, then the extreme options seem to be getting support from the public. So people who want no deal are saying, let's get on with it and who cares, we've had enough of the EU, put an end to these talks. Whereas people who want a second referendum and ultimately to remain, they're saying that because the compromise isn't working, we should really forget that we ever did this. We should go back to the people and allow them to say that the whole thing was a terrible mistake. So this is the trouble with this thing, that Mrs May was always a compromise candidate, and the compromise seems not to have really played well with the public.
So there is that kind of momentum building on the let's cut our losses now and get out of this. But let me ask you personally, where do you see Brexit going among the British public?
Well, the really unfortunate thing is that the opinion polls before the referendum suggested that Remain would win. Then it turned out that the opinion polls weren't a reflection of who was actually going to vote. They were, I believe, an accurate reflection of opinion, but they weren't an accurate prediction of how people would vote. And I think, in a way, there's a risk that those who want a second referendum are faced with a similar set of opinion polls, where Remain is certainly in the lead, and there is evidence to suggest younger people would like Remain, and therefore, as older people, perhaps pass away, they're replaced by younger people who are more likely to vote Remain. But this is all probability or possibility, and the only thing I think which is certain is that a second referendum would divide the country again, and as the delay goes on, people are actually on the Leave side quite rightly getting frustrated and angry. And so the second referendum isn't a very attractive proposition. I've always wondered if Parliament could somehow manage this in a way which meant that we were stuck in an endless transition, and eventually opinion changed. There was another referendum, and we remain within the EU. But again, that really is a very risky programme. So the leadership campaign is just one more element in which is a horribly complicated, difficult and frustrating process, which is the greatest political crisis Britain has faced since the Second World War.
Okay, Mark Garnett, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us from Lancaster.
My pleasure.